Thanks everyone for joining us. Good morning. Yeah, we'll dive right in. This one is called Covering All Bases, this presentation, and this really is geared towards the underdogs, applying for these massive overarching federal grants and maybe not having the capacity. That's a very common thing that we run into, and there are resources out there for you. So let's dive in. Next slide. So what is disadvantaged? We're not addressing the historically disadvantaged piece here, which is typically used for racial and ethnic groups. I do grants work surrounding that as well, but specifically within the federal grant scope, we are referring to disadvantaged applicants that are rural, that are economically disadvantaged and underserved, mostly because of where they find themselves geographically and the resources that are there. That includes tribal entities as well. And additionally, because we're dealing with kind of lower populations than metropolitan areas, the impact of those projects may not be as competitive in review for federal grants. Next slide. So how does this affect applications? Obviously, numbers game, impact. There are metropolitan groups out there who have staffing levels that are greater than the population size of many municipalities that we may be working with. It's a capacity issue, and therefore it's also an impact issue as well, even though these projects are desperately needed. Another way that this affects applications: limited match dollars for project completion. When we're dealing with these big infrastructure projects, we're talking multi-million-dollar projects that may exceed some of the budgetary availabilities of rural groups. Where do they pull those dollars from? We'll dive into that as well a little bit later. There are some capacity building resources that are there for you. Also economically disadvantaged due to geography, population size, and existing community resources. There may be limited private resources, corporate resources for these rural, kind of hard to reach zones. And then finally, rural municipalities, they often have limited capacity to produce a competitive application. There are these big NOFOs that are released, dozens of pages, in just what you have to review, and there may be a 30 to 45 day turnaround. That's just a pretty hard gap to traverse. And so again, there are resources for that. We will get into that. Next slide. And so what I typically see is rural municipalities and disadvantaged groups jumping into federal grants, a type of federal grant application that they may not be ready for. Disadvantaged applicants may feel they have no choice but to apply for funding due to resource scarcity. What that means is, here's this awesome federal grant application that came out. Let's say it's a transportation project or a water project. It looks like a once in a blue moon type of funding opportunity, and you feel like you have to go for it. You have to go for the whole entire thing. You may feel limited in kind of going through the steps that would produce a successful application. So you go all in. And by doing that, you may be disadvantaging yourself even more so in the grant review process. So here are some common considerations, and this is really at the crux of this presentation. And this is what I would urge every disadvantaged applicant to consider. Has planning been completed? That is number one. Are there bids in place? Meaning, do you have a good idea of what your project is actually going to cost that you are presenting for funding? Are those bids current? Are they within 30, 60, 90 days, whatever the threshold is, for a federal review team to view that as responsive? And are there authorizations in place for you to apply? Meaning, has your town council or equivalent group authorized you to make this grant application? So I'm going to use an adage from the military here, the 7 Ps. Maybe you've heard of this. Prior proper planning prevents piss poor performance. Very, very important. And planning is probably the most critical aspect of being successful with a federal grant application, especially for these large infrastructure projects. Next slide. So planning versus capital, and some of you guys may know this. I imagine that you do. As these NOFOs come out, there are typically two types of funnels that you can go through in terms of how your application is going to be processed, what type of application it is. It will be either planning, meaning building your capacity to break ground and actually deliver a capital project, versus capital. You are ready to go. This is a bona fide shovel-ready project, and you've done all of your groundwork, no pun intended. And so this is pretty common now for federal grants. It's two application types. I'm just going to say this, in 99% of all circumstances, if you have not completed your planning for a capital project, you have no business applying for the full-on capital funding request, or to kind of bundle your application as both a planning grant and a capital grant. I've done it all at this point, and I have seen little success when you go that route, unless there is some kind of background work that has been done. You have been formally invited to apply, knowing that this is going to be your application type. And it typically involves the work of, coordinating with state Senate offices and things like that. It is very rare, and I would just highly suggest against it. So in my mind, the planning grant has become the grant to get the grant. It buys in support for future investment should you be awarded, and it really affords you the capacity to be competitive once you are applying for several $1 million, typically in federal funding for infrastructure improvements. And it's my guidance as well that unless you're at 75% or more of project design planning completion, and you are going to complete that planning before or within 3 to 5 months of a capital grant application determination, then I do not believe that you are ready for a capital grant submission. Another thing that you will need to address is you as the applicant will have to confidently be able to remove project barriers within 6 months of capital grant application determination. Sometimes that might not even be enough. This is a very competitive process where you are going up against other applicants that maybe have already figured this out, and therefore they will be more competitive in review. Next slide. So why is planning so important? There is a laundry list. You have accurate costs for your project. You have a project timeline that you can reference that is professionally delivered and referenceable. There's traffic control figured out if you're doing surface street projects. You've gone through historic preservation, archaeology, type of notifications and processes. You figured out feasibility. Hopefully, you've removed right-of-way. You've obtained easements. You have gone through environmental, which is a kind of increasingly important piece that is needed for federal grants. You've hopefully completed design and engineering. And then another piece that is kind of lost in the mix here is the equity piece. You've solicited community input. You've got a sense of how this project may impact your community. And most importantly, you are authorized and shovel ready to pursue this project. Next slide. And so I'll just say this, as disadvantaged applicants are working with typically architect or engineering firms, it is so important to, and this is mostly standard, but it's always worth reiterating that all project planning and design work must be done to federal standards. And so this is not only true for federal grants, this is also true for state infrastructure grants as well. This is an increasing federal grant requirement for Bureau of Reclamation, EPA, U.S. Department of Agriculture. They will not typically consider a substantial investment unless you have completed design work, and not only is it done, but it is done to federal standards. So next slide. This is probably the most important piece that I want to highlight from this presentation. obviously, disadvantaged applicants, you guys can be so overwhelmed. I believe that your work is kind of unheralded. We see city and town managers doing way more than just managing the city or town. They are finance director, they are public works director, they are spinning so many different plates that you guys may not really have the attention span or the time to produce a competitive application. So there's some things that I want to go over here. For planning specifically, there are state grants that Arizona has released over the past fiscal year that are dedicated towards getting you planning dollars. It is a simple application. It is for communities with a population of 10,000 or less, or counties with a population of 150,000 or less. Through the Arizona Smart Fund, which I have to give huge credit to the Arizona Department of Transportation, they acknowledged that at the federal level, rural groups are just not as competitive as metropolitan groups. And there are substantial investments that need to be made in rural transportation infrastructure. So this is a dedicated fund towards building your planning capacity, and they will fully fund at 100% all of your design needs for your transportation project. You have to identify a federal grant register program to apply for in the upcoming fiscal year and complete the design work. And those are really the only two contractual pieces that you are required to do. We were able to obtain millions for rural groups over this past year, and it's made the difference. For water projects, USDA has a program called the Search Grant. The Search Grant is for, I believe, $30,000 to $40,000 for preliminary engineering reports for either a drinking water system or a wastewater system. I've had municipalities get both of them, and that has opened the door for multi-million-dollar investments in their water infrastructure, as well as made them eligible for federal grants. So those are just a few kind of referenceable places for capacity building support that I will kind of redirect a lot of municipal clients when they are not quite ready, but there are resources out there for them to kind of to engage. Next slide. And so Local First Arizona, that's who I work alongside through the Arizona Economic Recovery Center, calling all disadvantaged applicants. Through the AZERC, you can have 4 federal grants fully developed and submitted for you for free. This is a huge capacity building program that acknowledges kind of the restrictions that many disadvantaged applicants have in terms of time and resources. We've been incredibly successful over the past year. I think we're starting to get close to $40 million in success, yearly success just over the past year. And those are with some exceedingly rural groups. And we are just so proud of that success. And next slide. All right. So another reason why planning is so important for capital grants, once the planning is complete, oh, sorry, if you have questions for John. Oh, sorry. Okay, great. Capital grants overview. Once planning is complete, the grants kind of write themselves. You're talking about qualified architects and engineers who they've done this for years. They're handing over typically a 100+ page document that goes through options for design, that goes through the specifics for timelines and things of that nature. That is going to be maybe your best friend when applying for federal grants and technically speaking to what your project is. Some other measures of competitiveness that I really want, and this is why we're calling it covering all bases, because as a disadvantaged applicant, you have a lot of makeup ground to cover and to make up in order to be competitive. Other measures of competitiveness include letters of support. I believe that you need to go to neighboring municipalities. You need to go to the state legislature for your legislative district and congressional district. Mark Kelly's office and Kirsten Sinema's office, they have been so incredibly helpful for rural applicants and disadvantaged applicants in providing letters of support. You need to have municipality authorization to apply. Overarching community support, especially for equity, cannot be overstated. Having letters of support from heritage groups, other cultural groups in the community that show collaboration, those have been huge. You need to have up-to-date cost estimates, very important. And then additionally, if you foresee any unanticipated barriers to your project, and there's usually a question about this on the federal grant application, you really need to be comprehensive in how you will have the capacity to address that. Because reviewers, they are going through dozens, if not hundreds of applications. They will be able to identify potential barriers. You might as well beat them to the punch and provide as much assurance as you can. Obviously, alignment with the funding opportunity. It needs to be a great opportunity for you that matches your project. And match dollar support, whether that's from town reserves, general fund, whether that's through these capacity building programs that I've referenced for grants. You need to be as ready as possible. For rural and tribal groups, what we are seeing more of is a match waiver. So, you may not actually have to provide the 25% or 50% match that is required of the grant. Sometimes there is a match waiver because you are disadvantaged. However, oftentimes having the match dollar support, that is going to make you more competitive and more of a ready project to proceed. Next slide. And this is like probably the most important thing for me and for the folks that are putting these grants together, which includes you. Debrief. So even prior to engaging in a federal grant application and during, you need to value your time and efforts. By being prepared, you are going to capitalize on your time and your energy. That's why planning is just so critical throughout this whole entire process. Upon federal grant submission, please practice self-care, do a project debrief with your team. Make sure that they have some time to recharge their batteries as well. And the quality of the application, this is typically reflected by these processes, by giving yourself the time to be prepared in your application, build your capacity throughout the process, and to take care of yourself after the fact. That's often reflected on the quality of the application itself. Next slide. And so if you guys have any questions, you can drop them in the chat here. Also, I'm available via email, john@goodcreations.org. That is our private fundraising business. And then Local First Arizona, such an incredible organization. And they are doing the Rural Policy Forum, actually, both, let's see, it's today, tomorrow, and Friday out in Globe. There's going to be hundreds of rural and disadvantaged groups out there that are collectively building their capacity together. If you are interested in engaging them for grant writing services, Katie is the person to go to. She is so awesome. Feel free to reach out to her. She would be elated. And thank you guys so much.